On a cold Tuesday morning in April of 2017, a factory manager in a pressed gray suit stood at the gate of a run-down-looking farm in northern Ontario, and he laughed at the man standing in front of him. He laughed for a long time, longer than was polite. The man he was laughing at wore rubber boots caked to the ankle in mud, a flannel shirt washed so many times the pattern had almost surrendered, and an expression so calm it seemed almost out of place. The manager had driven 2 hours to be here. In his breast pocket was a letter folded into thirds that would legally end an arrangement this farm had depended on for 20 years. He had scheduled 15 minutes for this meeting. He assumed that was generous. Before we go on, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell so you never miss a story. And now, let's continue. 3 hours later, that same manager sat alone in his company car at the end of the gravel driveway with the engine off, staring through the windshield at nothing, and made 2 phone calls he had never planned to make. By September, his company had signed an agreement with the man in the muddy boots, an agreement that reversed everything the manager had come there to do. And for the rest of his career, whenever anyone at Northgate Timber mentioned the word sawdust, he went quiet. What happened in those 3 hours, what the manager saw when he finally walked through that gate, is something almost nobody in that town believed was possible. Not the neighbors who had complained for 2 decades, not the kids who had invented a cruel nickname, not the bank, not even, for a long stretch of years, the farmer's own mother. Every single one of them looked at the same 42 acres and saw the same thing: failure, an eyesore, a boy wasting his life on garbage. They were all looking at it. None of them were seeing it. To understand what the manager saw that morning and why it stopped his laughter mid-breath, you have to go back 19 years to a warm October afternoon in 1998, and to the moment an 11-year-old boy pushed his bare hand into a pile of industrial waste and felt something that made no sense at all. The Callaway farm sat on 42 acres of thin, tired soil about 3 kilometers east of the mill district outside Timmins, Ontario. Wyatt's grandfather had broken that ground in 1961, back when breaking ground still felt like a promise. By the late 90s, the promise had mostly run out. The soil was pale and sandy in the worst sections, gray as ash in others, the kind of dirt that drinks a rainstorm and gives nothing back. It grew potatoes reluctantly, hay grudgingly, and debt very well. Wyatt's father, Earl Callaway, had worked that land his entire adult life, and it had worked him back. He died of a heart attack in the winter of 1996, 2 days after his 49th birthday, leaving behind a mortgage the farm could barely carry, a tractor that started on the 3rd try if it started at all, and a wife named Darlene, who had never once planned on running a farm alone. She ran it anyway. That was the kind of woman Darlene Callaway was. She sold what the land would give, took in bookkeeping work from businesses in town, patched the roof herself with a borrowed ladder and a bad knee, and never once, in the memory of anyone who knew her, asked a neighbor for help she couldn't repay. Wyatt was 9 when his father died. He was old enough to understand what sacrifice looked like when he watched his mother at the kitchen table at midnight, with the bills spread out in front of her like a losing hand of cards, and young enough to feel completely helpless about it. He wanted to fix something. He just had no idea what. Half a kilometer up the road stood the Northgate Timber Processing Facility, a mid-size mill that had been cutting and planing northern lumber since 1983. And here is where the whole story quietly begins, with an arrangement so small and so ordinary that nobody involved in it thought about it twice. In the spring of 1997, a mill foreman had knocked on Earl Callaway's door with a simple problem and a simple offer. The mill was producing more sawdust than it could reasonably get rid of. Hauling it to approved disposal sites cost money. The Callaway fence line was conveniently close, conveniently rural, and conveniently owned by a man who could use $40 extra a month. Earl said yes. He was dead within the year. But nobody at the mill canceled the arrangement, and Darlene never asked them to, because $40 was $40, and grief does not pause a mortgage. So every Tuesday and every Friday, a flatbed truck backed through a gap in the chain-link fence at the eastern edge of the property and dumped its load. By the end of the summer of 1998, there were 4 mounds of pale yellow sawdust standing against the fence line, each one roughly 4 meters high and 12 meters long, sitting in the sun like dunes that had wandered north and gotten lost. The mill called it disposal. The neighbors called it a dump. Darlene called it $40. Wyatt called it interesting. That October, on an afternoon when the first frost had already come and gone and the grass crunched underfoot in the mornings, 11-year-old Wyatt Callaway walked the fence line the way bored farm kids walk fence lines, kicking at things, and stopped at the oldest of the 4 mounds. Something was rising off the top of it in the cold air, a faint shimmer, almost like breath. He climbed partway up the side, pushed his bare hand deep into the base of the pile, down past the loose, dry surface layer, and froze. The sawdust at the center was warm. Not sun warm, not leftover afternoon warm. It was warm the way a living thing is warm. In October, in northern Ontario. He pulled his hand out and stared at it, then pushed it back in, deeper this time, and held it there while the cold wind moved across the field behind him. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell anyone at school. He just came back the next day to check whether it was still true. It was. He came back the day after that. Still true. He came back in November when the first snow dusted the tops of the mounds and watched the snow melt off the oldest pile in patches while it sat untouched on the newer ones. And he stood there in his winter coat looking at a pile of industrial waste that was somehow generating its own heat, and something in his 11-year-old mind quietly locked into place and never let go. Something was happening inside that pile. Something was alive in there, and nobody else on Earth seemed to care. Here is what Wyatt did not know at 11, and what it would take him years of borrowed library books and photocopied journal articles and humiliating failure to learn. Sawdust is not garbage. It never was. It is wood reduced to its finest possible fiber, and wood is one of the most energy-dense organic materials on the planet. Cellulose, lignin, trace minerals. A mid-size mill like Northgate produces 20 to 40 tons of the stuff every single week as an unavoidable byproduct, and almost all of it across the entire industry gets landfilled, burned, or dumped somewhere out of sight because in its raw form it is too fine to build with and too stubborn to rot quickly. But given time, moisture, and the right microscopic company, sawdust does something remarkable. It transforms. Billions of bacteria and fungi move in and begin breaking those wood fibers down, and that breakdown releases heat, real, measurable heat, sometimes enough to push the core of a large pile past 60 degrees Celsius. Steam on a cold morning, warmth under a boy's hand in October, and at the end of that long, invisible process, what remains looks a great deal like the dark, crumbly, water-holding topsoil that exhausted farmland dreams about. The heat Wyatt felt was decomposition. It was the sound of an engine running that nobody had ever bothered to listen to. But there is a catch, and the catch is what defeats nearly everyone who ever tries to do something useful with sawdust. Wyatt would learn the catch the hard way, in public, at the expense of his mother's potato crop. By 13, Wyatt had borrowed every book on soil that the Timmins Public Library would lend him, some of them twice. He had a teacher who let him photocopy pages out of agricultural journals, and he kept a notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing filled with careful, small handwriting. Words like microbial decomposition and humic acid sat in the margins next to entries like Pile 3, center temperature 41 degrees, rained yesterday, steam this morning. He was 13 years old, and he was running a longitudinal field study out of his back pocket, and he would not have known to call it that. In the spring of 1999, he convinced his mother to let him spread a thin layer of half-rotted sawdust across 2 rows of the potato field. He had read that organic matter improved soil. He had a warm pile full of organic matter. The logic seemed airtight. The potatoes came up stunted, pale, weak, yellow-green things that looked less like a crop and more like an apology. Wyatt stood at the edge of those 2 rows in June and felt his face burn because his mother was standing beside him, and those were food rows and money rows, and she looked at them for a long moment, and then simply said, "Well," and walked back to the house. That single word held more weight than an hour of shouting would have. He pulled every plant, he dug the sawdust back out by hand, and then he went back to the library because he needed to understand not just that he had failed, but exactly why. And the why turned out to be the single most important thing he ever learned. Raw sawdust, it turns out, is almost pure carbon, and the microbes that break carbon down need nitrogen to do the work, the same way a construction crew needs food. When you mix raw sawdust into living soil, those billions of microbes strip every trace of available nitrogen out of the ground to fuel their feast, and they strip it away from the plants. The soil doesn't get richer, it gets robbed. Agronomists call it nitrogen lockup, and done carelessly, it will starve a crop to death in weeks. That is precisely what Wyatt's pale potatoes were, starvation in plant form. The answer, buried in a composting manual from Saskatchewan, was balance. The pile itself had to be fed nitrogen before it ever touched a field. Manure, grass clippings, food scraps, anything green and rich blended in at a ratio of roughly 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Feed the pile correctly and the microbes multiply, the core heats up, and the whole mass breaks down into genuine finished compost, stable, dark, and safe. Feed it wrong, and it just sits there for a decade, a monument to wasted effort. So Wyatt started feeding the piles. He hauled manure from the south field in a wheelbarrow with a bad wheel. He collected grass clippings. He begged vegetable scraps off the kitchen. He turned sections of the oldest mound with a spade, by hand, alone, week after week, month after month. And he wrote everything down, and slowly, invisibly, in the far northwest corner of the property where the very worst soil sat, gray and sandy and barely able to hold a footprint, something began to change. By 2001, the grass in that corner was coming in greener than anywhere else on the farm. After rain, the ground there held its moisture instead of letting the water sheet off toward the ditch. To anyone driving past it was nothing. To Wyatt, who had photographed that corner every season for 3 years, it was everything. It was proof. He told no one, which was just as well, because by then, no one in Timmins wanted to hear it. You have to understand what those mounds looked like from the road by 2002. There were 11 of them now, stretching nearly 80 meters along the fence line, and the Callaway farm had quietly become the thing that rural communities cannot forgive, which is an eyesore. The Whitfield family ran cattle on the land to the south, and old Ross Whitfield had opinions about the mounds that he shared freely at the co-op, at the church, and at the hockey rink. To the north, an older couple named the Lundgrens grew market vegetables, and Mrs. Lundgren had twice mentioned to Darlene in the gentlest possible voice, which is the most devastating possible voice, that she wondered when the piles might be dealt with. At school, it was worse, because teenagers do not bother with gentle. One of the Whitfield boys, Cody, started calling him Sawdust Wyatt, and the name stuck the way names do in small towns, which is to say, permanently. A girl in his class named Hannah DeForge announced to a full cafeteria table that the Callaway place smelled like a hamster cage and got the laugh she was fishing for. And Tyler Marsh, who had been Wyatt's closest friend since the 2nd grade, who had spent 100 summer afternoons on that farm, simply stopped coming around. No fight, no conversation, just a slow fade, the way 14-year-olds abandon anything that costs them social standing. Cars slowed down on the road to look at the mounds the way people slow down to look at accidents. Wyatt absorbed all of it without visible reaction, which people mistook for not caring. It was not that. It was that he had done the math in his head and concluded that arguing was a waste of energy he needed for hauling manure. But there were nights, and he admitted this only many years later, when he sat in the equipment shed with his notebook in his lap and wondered whether everyone else could see something he couldn't. Whether the whole thing really was garbage, and the only person in town too stubborn to recognize it was him. Then came 2003, and the year that almost ended everything. It began with the drought. That summer, northern Ontario got less rain between May and August than anyone could remember, and the Callaway hay crop, the farm's one dependable earner, came in at less than half its usual yield. The vegetable rows fared little better. By August, the pond in the south field was a cracked brown dish, and in September, the letter from the bank arrived. The polite kind of letter banks send first, the kind full of phrases like reviewing the terms of your obligation, which is a bank's way of clearing its throat before it says the word foreclosure out loud. Darlene took a second bookkeeping client in town, which meant she was now working 7 days a week. And in October, Ross Whitfield drove up the Callaway driveway in his good truck, sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and made Darlene an offer to buy the northern 20 acres of the farm outright. Cash. It was a fair price. It was also, and everyone at that table understood this, the beginning of the end, because a 42-acre farm cut down to 22 acres is not a farm anymore. It is a countdown. Wyatt was 16. He stood in the hallway outside the kitchen and listened to the offer and heard his mother say she would think about it. And that night, the worst pile failure of his life happened, as if the universe had decided to pile on. He had been experimenting with a larger compost windrow that fall, his most ambitious yet, and he had gotten the moisture wrong. Too wet, too compacted, not enough turning. The pile went anaerobic, which is the polite scientific term for what happens when the oxygen-breathing microbes suffocate and a different, fouler crew takes over. The smell that came off that pile for the following 2 weeks was not the sweet cedar smell of the old mounds. It was rot. Genuine, carrying on the wind rot. And the wind carried it directly north to the Lundgren property. And the Lundgrens, patient for 5 long years, finally filed a complaint with the township. The letter from the municipal office gave the Callaways 90 days to demonstrate that the accumulated material on the property was being actively managed, or to remove it entirely. Removal, Wyatt calculated, would cost more than the farm cleared in a year. So there it was, all of it at once, the drought, the bank, the Whitfield offer sitting on the table, the township deadline, and a 17th summer coming up in which Wyatt Callaway had exactly one asset to his name, which was a notebook full of temperature readings and a corner of a field that had turned green, and no one on earth but him believed the two were connected. The conversation that saved the farm happened on a Sunday night in November at the kitchen table, and it was the closest thing to a fight that Wyatt and his mother ever had. Darlene laid it out plainly because she was too tired to do it any other way. The Whitfield money would clear the debt. The farm would shrink but survive. She could stop working 7 days. It was, by every measure an adult could apply, the responsible choice. And Wyatt, 16 years old, slid his notebook across the table, opened to the pages on the northwest corner, and made the only argument he had. Not a speech. Numbers. Photographs, season by season, of gray dirt becoming dark dirt, moisture readings, grass density, and then one sentence that Darlene would repeat to people, word for word, for the rest of her life. He said, the 20 acres he wants to buy is the 20 acres I've almost fixed. Because that was the thing. The northern section, the parcel Ross Whitfield wanted, the parcel closest to the mounds, was the section Wyatt had been quietly treating for 5 years. Whitfield wasn't offering to take the worst of the farm off their hands. He was, without knowing it, offering to buy the only part of the farm that was getting better, and he was offering to buy it at exhausted soil prices. Darlene sat with the notebook for a long time. She turned the pages slowly, and Wyatt watched her do it, and later he said that watching his mother read that notebook was the single most frightening experience of his life. Worse than the bank letter, worse than any of it, because everything lived or died on whether she could see what he saw. She closed the notebook. She looked at her son, and she said, "All right, 90 days, show the township." And then she stood up and made tea, and the Whitfield offer was never spoken of in that kitchen again. What followed was the hardest winter of Wyatt's life, and the making of him. To satisfy the township, he had to convert an accidental dump into something that looked, on paper and in person, like a managed operation. He rebuilt the failed windrow, turned it by hand until the rot smell died and the sweet heat came back. He drew up a site plan on graph paper, laid out the piles in ordered rows, posted hand-painted signs labeling each one by age and stage, and dragged the township inspector, a skeptical man named Mr. Okafor, through the whole system in February with steam rising off the turned piles into the -20 air. Okafor pushed his own gloved hand into the core of pile 6, the way Wyatt showed him, and felt the heat, and stood there for a moment with an expression Wyatt recognized, because it was the same expression Wyatt himself had worn in October of 1998. The complaint was closed in March. The bank got its payments, barely, through Darlene's second job and the sale of the old tractor Wyatt had finally fixed and could no longer justify keeping. The farm stayed whole, and something in Wyatt shifted that winter, from a boy defending a hobby to a young man who had defended a position under fire and held it. The summer he turned 18, he borrowed a truck and drove 4 hours to the Provincial Agricultural Extension Office in Sudbury because he had run out of things the Timmins Library could teach him. He spent 2 days going through composting manuals and soil regeneration case studies, and on the second day, a staff soil scientist named Dr. Sandra Pruitt sat down with him, initially out of professional courtesy, the way experts humor enthusiastic amateurs. The courtesy lasted about 10 minutes, then she asked to see the notebook again. She went quiet over his temperature logs. She asked about his carbon inputs, his turning schedule, the timeline of changes in the northwest corner, and Wyatt answered every question without hesitation because he had lived every answer. At the end of the afternoon, she looked at him across her desk and asked how much land he had. 42 acres, he said, about 18 workable. And how long, she asked, before the rest is workable? Wyatt thought about it honestly because he was incapable of thinking about it any other way. 6 years, he said, maybe 7. Dr. Pruitt nodded slowly. That's probably right, she said, if you keep doing exactly what you're doing. He drove home through 4 hours of northern dark, and somewhere past Gogama, alone on an empty highway, it landed on him that a scientist with a doctorate had just checked his work and found it correct. Not promising. Not cute. Correct. He had spent 7 years being the town joke, and it turned out the joke had been peer-reviewed. What he felt was not exactly confidence. It was something quieter and far more durable. Certainty. After Sudbury, the operation stopped being an experiment and started being a build, and Wyatt made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He decided to stop explaining himself. Completely. No more showing the notebook, no more defending the piles. The town had made up its mind about Sawdust Wyatt, and he concluded that their opinion was, from a practical standpoint, free camouflage. Let them think it was garbage. Garbage doesn't attract competitors, or rent increases, or opinions. He would build in silence and let the results speak whenever the results were ready, and not 1 minute before. So from the road, for the next decade, the Callaway farm looked like nothing much, and behind the fence line, piece by piece, year by year, something was being assembled. The worms came first, in 2005. Wyatt had read about vermicomposting in a Saskatchewan agricultural bulletin, the practice of running finished compost through beds of red wiggler worms, whose digestion concentrates nutrients into a substance called vermicast. Vermicast is to ordinary compost what espresso is to weak coffee. dark, fine, and gram for gram carrying vastly more plant-available nutrition. He mail-ordered a starter culture, built wooden frame beds in a corner of the old equipment shed, killed his first 2 colonies through inexperience, took notes on exactly how he had killed them, and got the 3rd colony thriving. Within 2 years, the worm beds ran the length of the shed, and the test plots receiving vermicast were producing vegetables that made the rest of the field look like a before photograph. Then, almost by accident, the mushrooms. At a used book sale in town, Wyatt paid 50 cents for a battered guide to log mushroom cultivation, read it in one sitting, and hit a sentence that stopped him cold. Hardwood sawdust, the book noted, properly sterilized, is among the finest growing substrates in the world for gourmet fungi. He read the sentence 3 times. He had spent his entire life surrounded by the finest growing substrate in the world. It had been raining down on the property twice a week since he was 9. He ordered shiitake spawn from an Ontario supplier, built 12 inoculated beds in the eastern shed in the spring of 2007, failed twice, adjusted humidity, and by late September harvested his first 2 kilograms of dense, dark shiitake mushrooms. He drove them to the Timmins Farmers Market on a Saturday morning, set them out in wooden baskets with a hand-lettered price sign, and sold every last one in 40 minutes. An older woman bought the final basket and asked whether he would have more next week, and Wyatt heard himself say yes and drove home doing arithmetic against the steering wheel. Vegetables from the reclaimed rows, vermicast, mushrooms grown on the very material the whole town called waste. 3 products, all flowing from one system, and the system's raw input was being delivered to his fence line for free, twice a week, by a company that considered itself lucky he took it. He kept the sheds locked, he told his mother, and no one else. What happened between 2008 and 2016 happened the way soil improves, which is to say gradually, then suddenly. And because Wyatt had chosen silence, the town experienced those years as a series of small, puzzling details that nobody bothered to assemble. In 2009, a used polytunnel greenhouse frame appeared on the south edge of the property, and the town assumed he was tinkering. In 2011, a second tunnel joined it, and people assumed the first one must have failed and been replaced, because assuming failure was by now a Timmins tradition where the Callaways were concerned. Nobody outside the farm knew that the last of the original sawdust mounds, the 11 infamous eyesores, had been fully processed through the compost system that same year, ground down to nothing, and reborn as topsoil, or that Wyatt had planted a windbreak of spruce along the old fence line where they used to stand. Nobody noticed that a refrigerated van had started leaving the property before dawn on Thursdays. Nobody wondered why a restaurant supplier from Sudbury drove up twice a month, or why the farm had quietly incorporated in 2013 under a name nobody in town had ever heard spoken aloud, Callaway Agricultural Systems. When a job posting for 2 farmhands appeared on the co-op corkboard in 2014, people assumed Darlene's health must be failing. When a 3rd greenhouse tunnel went up, connected to the first 2, someone at the diner said the boy never did know when to quit, and everyone nodded, and that was the extent of the town's investigation. The one person who could have told them was Darlene, and Darlene Callaway had spent 15 years watching this town enjoy itself at her son's expense. She said nothing to anyone, and there was a certain flavor to her silence in those years that her closest friends described, much later, as a woman patiently holding the best card anyone in that town had ever been dealt. And so we arrive back where we began. April 2017. A pressed gray suit, a letter folded into thirds, and a manager named Brent Gallagher standing at the gate, laughing. Gallagher had arrived at Northgate Timber the month before, 34 years old, an MBA out of a regional office in Sault Ste. Marie, carrying a corporate mandate to cut the facility's operating costs by 15% in 12 months. He was good at his job in the way a metal detector is good at its job. He swept the facility's books and beeped at everything, and within 3 weeks, he beeped at a line item so strange he assumed it was a clerical error. The company was paying a nearby farmer every month to take away a product that other companies would pay to buy. Because sawdust, by 2017, had a market. Wood pellet manufacturers wanted it. Particle board plants wanted it. Biomass energy facilities wanted it. Gallagher ran the numbers and found that Northgate was giving away for negative $40 a month material with a potential resale value in the tens of thousands of dollars a year. And it was all going to some hobby farm down the road, on the strength of a handshake made in 1997 by two men who were both long gone. There was no contract, there was barely a paper trail. To a man like Gallagher, the whole arrangement was an open wound in the balance sheet, and closing it would be the easiest win of his first quarter. The letter he sent in April was polite in the way corporate letters are polite, which is to say it smiled while it took things away. Deliveries would cease within 60 days. Furthermore, since the delivered material had never been formally transferred, any remaining sawdust on the Callaway property arguably belonged to Northgate, and the company reserved the right to recover it for resale. There was a closing paragraph about municipal zoning and industrial waste accumulation, included, Gallagher would privately admit years later, mostly to frighten. Wyatt read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside it. He read it twice. Then he set it down, looked out the window for a while at the south tunnels catching the early light, and started to laugh, quietly, alone in the kitchen, because the letter threatened to repossess sawdust that had ceased to exist 6 years earlier, and because the company that had spent 20 years dumping on his family's land was now describing that dumping as an asset transfer. Then he picked up the phone, called the mill, and asked in a perfectly even voice for a meeting with the new manager on the property. There were some things, he said, that would be easier to discuss in person. Gallagher agreed with the mild condescension he applied to most things beneath his attention, scheduled 15 minutes on a Tuesday morning, and drove out expecting to meet a struggling smallholder who would either plead or bluster. When Wyatt met him at the gate in mud-caked boots and old flannel, Gallagher felt his expectations confirm themselves, and when Wyatt said calmly that ending the deliveries would be a serious mistake for Northgate, Gallagher laughed. It was, in fairness to him, a reasonable thing to find funny, a man who looked like this telling a company what to do with its waste stream. "Let me get this straight," Gallagher said, wiping the corner of his eye. "You called me out here to tell me I can't stop the sawdust deliveries, because the sawdust is valuable." Wyatt let the laughter finish completely. He didn't shift his weight, and he didn't look away. "I didn't call you here about the sawdust," he said. "I called you here to show you what I built." And he pushed open the gate. Now, it would make a tidy story to say Gallagher walked through, saw the farm, and surrendered on the spot. That is not what happened. Brent Gallagher was not a stupid man, and he was not an easy one, and he spent the next 2 hours fighting what he was looking at with every tool he had, which is exactly what made his eventual surrender mean something. The first thing he saw was the greenhouse complex, 3 connected polytunnels running 40 meters each along the southern edge, full and green and humming with drip irrigation in April, in northern Ontario, and his honest first reaction was that they must belong to someone else. He actually asked, "Whose are these?" "Mine," Wyatt said, and kept walking. Gallagher recovered fast, the way MBAs are trained to, and reached for the first available frame. "Greenhouses are capital-intensive," he said. "Margins on produce this far north must be brutal." Wyatt didn't argue. He just mentioned, in passing, the standing weekly orders from institutional kitchens in 4 northern municipalities, hospitals, and schools that had spent decades paying to truck vegetables up from the south, and let Gallagher do his own math about what a local supplier could charge against that freight cost. The second thing was the composting yard, and this was where Gallagher planted his flag and made his stand. 6 long-turned windrows in graded rows, thermometer stakes at intervals, a wheel loader parked at the end. Gallagher walked the rows and saw his angle. "This," he said, "is exactly what my letter is about. Industrial input accumulation. Whatever this operation is, it runs on our material, which means the zoning question is live, and frankly, it means this whole business sits on a supply we can cut off in 60 days. It was a good shot. It was also the moment Wyatt handed him the first binder. Inside was a service contract, 3 years old, renewed once, between Callaway Agricultural Systems and the city of Timmins, under which the city paid Wyatt to divert organic waste from 17 restaurants, 2 grocery chains, and a regional school board food program away from the municipal landfill and into his composting operation. Gallagher stood in the middle of the yard reading a document that established, in plain municipal language, that the eyesore was a licensed waste processing facility, that the town which had mocked it was now paying it, and that the zoning threat in his own letter was aimed at an operation with cleaner paperwork than his mill. He read it twice. Then he said quietly, "This doesn't change the supply question. You still need our sawdust." And Wyatt said, "Walk with me," and took him to the mushroom facility. The old eastern barn had been converted years earlier, insulated, climate-controlled, racked floor to ceiling with substrate blocks fruiting shiitake, oyster, and lion's mane mushrooms for specialty grocers and restaurants in Sudbury, Timmins, and North Bay. 7 tons a year, with a waiting list of buyers the operation could not yet satisfy. And the substrate those mushrooms grew on, the irreplaceable foundation of the entire product line, was hardwood sawdust. Gallagher stood in the cool, damp air of that barn and understood, with the particular discomfort of a man watching his own leverage invert, that he had been half right all along. The sawdust really was valuable. He had simply been the last person in the story to find out, and the person he had come to threaten was the one who had proven it. He made his final stand in the yard outside, on the phone. He called the regional office in Sault Ste. Marie, walked to the fence for privacy that the wind didn't grant him, and Wyatt, standing a polite distance away, caught the shape of it. Gallagher reporting that the situation was more complicated than the file suggested. Gallagher saying the words, "established commercial operation." Gallagher going quiet for a long stretch while someone senior spoke, then saying, "Yes, but," twice, and being cut off twice. Because here is what the regional office understood immediately, faster than Gallagher wanted them to. Northgate had spent 20 years dumping industrial byproduct onto private land through an undocumented handshake, and the owner of that land had turned out to be, of all the farmers in Ontario, the single most sympathetic figure imaginable, a widow's son who had built a celebrated local business out of the company's waste. There was no version of a fight with that man that Northgate could win in a courtroom, in a newspaper, or at a town meeting. And there was, a sharper voice on that call pointed out, a version of a partnership that made the company look brilliant. Gallagher came back from the fence with his tie loosened and his 15-minute meeting entering its 3rd hour, and asked the question he had been sent, in the end, to ask. What would you actually want? And Wyatt, who had been ready for that question for 19 years, took him to one last place before answering. The far end of the property, the old fence line, where a windbreak of young spruce now stood in a neat row, and the ground beneath them was dark and loose and smelled like rain. "This is where your trucks used to dump," Wyatt said. 11 piles, 80 meters of them. Everything you saw today came out of what was sitting right here. And then he laid out the offer he had drafted in his head long before Gallagher's letter ever arrived. Northgate would resume deliveries, but structured now. Specific grades of clean hardwood sawdust, scheduled, documented, a proper supply agreement. In exchange, Northgate would receive priority purchasing rights on Wyatt's finished compost at fair commercial rates for use in the company's own reforestation nursery program, the seedling operation every licensed timber company in Ontario is required to run. The mill's waste would grow the mill's forests. Sawdust to soil to spruce and back again, a closed loop that would cut Northgate's nursery input costs, generate the kind of sustainability story that timber companies in 2017 were desperate to be able to tell truthfully, and cost Gallagher nothing but the pleasure of his original letter. Gallagher looked at the dark ground under the spruce trees for a long moment. He was doing math, because that was his nature, but Wyatt suspected, watching him, that for the first time that day, the math had company. Then Gallagher said, I came out here to shut you down." "I know," Wyatt said. Gallagher nodded slowly and put the folded letter back in his breast pocket, and it never came out again. The partnership agreement was signed that September, and it was Gallagher himself, to his credit, who pushed it through the regional office, rewrote the sustainability section of the company's annual report around it, and, at the signing, in front of two executives from Sault Ste. Marie, told the story of the morning he stood at a farm gate and laughed at Wyatt Callaway, telling it against himself, accurately, all the way to the end. He never laughed about sawdust again. But he told that story for years, and every time he was the fool in it, and every time he seemed oddly proud of that. Word of the deal moved through Timmins the way all news moves through towns that size, which is instantly and with corrections. And now, at last, the town had to assemble the puzzle pieces it had spent a decade ignoring. The Dawn van, the tunnels, the job postings, the incorporated name, and the picture that emerged of an operation clearing over $800,000 a year with 11 full-time employees and 4 seasonal hands, built by the boy they had called Sawdust Wyatt, produced a civic emotion for which there is no clean word, something between pride, embarrassment, and the sensation of having been politely outplayed for 19 consecutive years. What happened next is the part of the story Wyatt himself never brings up, so it has to be told for him. Cody Whitfield, the boy who invented the nickname, was running his family's cattle operation by then, and cattle country south of the Callaway place sat on the same tired soil as everywhere else. In the spring of 2018, Cody drove up the Callaway driveway, sat in his truck for a visibly long moment, and then came into the farm office and ordered 40 yards of finished compost for his hayfields. Wyatt filled the order at the standard rate, threw in soil testing at no charge, and never once, in the years of business that followed, mentioned the name Sawdust Wyatt, which, people who know both men agree, was somehow worse for Cody and better for everyone than any confrontation could have been. The Whitfield hayfields, for the record, have never yielded better. The Lundgrens, the gentle neighbors whose complaint had once nearly finished the farm, reached their late 70s and could no longer work their vegetable land. It was Wyatt who leased it from them at a generous rate and folded it into production, and it was Wyatt who plowed their driveway every winter after that without being asked. Mrs. Lundgren, near the end of her life, told her daughter that the smell that came across the fence line in summer now was tomatoes, and that she owed somebody an apology she didn't know how to give. She never quite gave it. He never needed it. Hannah DeForge, the girl from the cafeteria, grew up to run a well-regarded bistro in Sudbury. Her menu features, and has featured for years, lion's mane and shiitake mushrooms from a supplier listed by name, Callaway Agricultural Systems. Whether she remembers the hamster cage line is not recorded. The invoices are. And Tyler Marsh, the friend who faded. In 2019, among the applications for a posted farm technician job, there was his name. Wyatt read the application, sat with it for a while, and called him in. The interview, by both men's account, contained one difficult minute in which Tyler started a sentence about the old days, and Wyatt let it hang there just long enough, and then said, "Can you drive a loader?" Tyler could. He works there still. The friendship that came back was not the old one. It was a slower, adult one, built the way Wyatt built everything, patiently and without ceremony, and by most measures it holds better than the original. By 2022, Callaway Agricultural Systems had taken on a second property 12 kilometers east, more tunnels, a second mushroom barn, and a demonstration composting program that hosts agricultural students from 3 Northern Ontario colleges. Young people who arrive expecting a lecture and instead get handed a spade and a thermometer because Wyatt holds firmly that the pile is the lecture. Dr. Sandra Pruitt, retired now from the Extension Office, sits on the operations small advisory board and likes to tell the students that the best field study she ever reviewed was kept in a spiral notebook by a 13-year-old, and that she means that literally, and then she shows them the photocopies, because Wyatt let her keep photocopies. He was invited to speak at a soil health conference in Guelph. He declined the first invitation on the grounds that it was seeding season, which was true, and also that he did not much want to, which was truer. He accepted the second. He spoke for 20 minutes without slides, mostly about nitrogen, and got a standing ovation he seemed genuinely puzzled by. He still drives his father's truck, or rather the truck his mother kept running after his father died, which by now is less a vehicle than a family position statement. Darlene Callaway is 67. She lives in the original farmhouse, which has a new roof she did not have to climb up and patch herself. She keeps the books for the company because she is still the best bookkeeper in the district, and everyone knows it. And on warm evenings, she walks the property with her son. On those walks, she has been seen stopping in the greenhouse rows and touching the leaves of the plants, lightly with the backs of her fingers, the way a person touches something when they are checking whether it is real. She spent a lot of years at a kitchen table at midnight with the bills laid out like a losing hand. She does not sit up at midnight anymore. There was a time she worried about what would become of that land after her. That worry is gone, and the woman who carried it does not speak of it and does not have to. There is a version of this story that is about money, and the money is real. The revenue, the contracts, the second property, the company that came to threaten and stayed to sign. But that version misses the point, the way the whole town missed the piles. The real story fits inside one October afternoon in 1998, inside the 3 seconds after a boy pushed his hand into a mound of industrial waste and felt heat where the entire world had agreed there was nothing. Everything after that, the potato failure and the nitrogen lockup, the nickname and the lost friend, the drought and the bank and the 90-day deadline, the worms, the mushrooms, the locked sheds, and the 15 silent years, all of it was just the long, patient act of refusing to let go of what that heat meant. Because most of what the world calls waste is not waste. It is value that arrived somewhere inconvenient and was never looked at long enough to be understood. The sawdust was always going to become soil. Chemistry guaranteed it. The only question was whether anyone would stand there long enough to help it happen, while an entire town drove past slowly and laughed. One person stood there. For 19 years, through frost and foreclosure letters, and the particular loneliness of being certain about something no one else can see, one person kept his hand in the pile. And the man who laughed the loudest on a cold Tuesday morning at the gate drove away 3 hours later with his letter still folded in his pocket, having learned the same lesson the town learned, and the neighbors, and the bank, and everyone else who ever slowed down on that road to stare. The gap between what something is and what it could become is real. It is closable, and it belongs entirely to whoever is willing to look longer than everyone else. Wyatt Callaway looked longer. That was the whole secret. That was always the whole secret. Ladies and gentlemen, right now there are 3 links on your screen. On the left, our newest video. In the center, a square link to our channel. And on the right, a full playlist of stories just like this one. Give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and then enjoy the rest of our videos. Thank you.